Let us begin, dear viewer, with a man who might very well have been the least eligible bachelor in the ancient world, a figure so thoroughly uninterested in wealth, reputation, bodily hygiene, or indeed trousers of any kind, that he scandalized polite society and charmed the impolite ones. His name was Crates of Thebes, not to be confused with crates, the wooden storage device. No, this Crates was a man, albeit a man who bore more resemblance to a bundle of sticks with opinions than any reasonable notion of a functioning human. Crates was born sometime around 365 BC in Thebes, a city known for three things: mythological melodrama, formidable warriors, and a tendency to be burned down every few decades. Thebes had a habit of being at the center of things and yet never quite in control of them. A perfect crucible for eccentric genius, really. An eccentricity is precisely what Crates delivered, in bucketfuls, though not the kind you'd want near a dinner table. He began life, like so many of us do, in wealth and privilege, blessed with an inheritance large enough to ensure a lifetime of figs, silk tunics, and conversations about politics with other wealthy layabouts. But Crates, alas, or rather, hurrah, took one long look at the plush comforts of bourgeois living and said, absolutely not. With a grin bordering on the maniacal, he gave it all away, every last drachma. The mansions, the servants, the inherited nonsense of status and expectation. Gone. And why? Because Crates had become intoxicated, not with wine, though I wouldn't put it past him, but with philosophy. And not just any philosophy, mind you, none of your polite Socratic dialogue or Pythagorean abstinence. No, Crates fell head over unwashed heels for cynicism. That glorious, mud-splattered, dog-barking, nose-thumbing school of thought that declared with righteous snark that virtue was the only true good, and everything else, gold, glory, gossip columns, was piffle. Dangerous piffle at that. His mentor, or rather his spiritual hooligan-in-chief, was Diogenes of Sinope. Diogenes, a man who lived in a barrel and once defecated during a philosophical debate just to make a point, though what that point was is still mercifully unclear. Diogenes was the kind of man who, if alive today, would probably live in an IKEA car park, sleep in a wheelie bin, and write essays in faces on the sides of bank buildings. And Crates loved him. But while Diogenes barked and bellowed and scandalized Athens like a feral prophet, Crates was a gentler sort of cynic, less of a rabid dog, more of a scruffy spaniel, still inconvenient, still prone to rummaging through philosophical bins, but somehow endearing. He took the central tenets of cynicism, autarkia, self-sufficiency, ascesis, discipline, and parrhesia, frank speech, and wore them like a cloak, quite literally. That and nothing else most days. So what did our unshaven hero do after renouncing wealth? Why, he ambled through the streets of Athens, wearing a single threadbare garment, carrying a stick, for rhetorical emphasis, and the occasional dog, and perhaps a crust of bread or a radish in a pouch, if it was a good day. He declaimed philosophy not from marble steps, but from the gutters, drawing crowds with his unorthodox charisma and the lingering scent of onions. And here lies the glorious paradox. Crates, the man who owned nothing, gave everything. He gave laughter, wisdom, perspective. He would approach the wealthy in their chariots, the scholars in their academies, the politicians mid-pontification, and deliver lines so devastatingly simple and correct that even their slaves would laugh. He was, by all accounts, charming. Unlike Diogenes, who once told Alexander the Great to move because he was blocking the sun, Crates managed to offend and enlighten in the same breath, like a dinner guest who insults your wallpaper but somehow ends up being the best conversationalist you've ever met. His most astonishing act, perhaps, was his partnership with the marvelous Hipparchia, a woman of noble birth who was supposed to marry a suitably dull young man and spend her life supervising household slaves and attending poetry readings. But she encountered Crates, fell in love with both his mind and his complete lack of property, and insisted on joining his muddy crusade. He tried very gallantly to dissuade her. According to some accounts, he even disrobed in front of her to show the full extent of what she'd be marrying into. But rather than fleeing, she smiled and said, "Yes, that'll do nicely." They lived as equals, unheard of in Athens at the time, walking the streets together, teaching by example, sleeping under porticos, and proving that a life stripped of pretense could still be filled with joy, intellect, and radishes. Not everyone was impressed. The upper classes clutched their pearls, and the philosophers in their ivory towers wrote disapproving scrolls. But those who listened, really listened, found in Crates a sort of ragged enlightenment. He wasn't trying to burn the world down, just shake it by the lapels. He believed that if you could let go of what you were told you needed, money, fame, status, an acceptable odor, you might just discover what you actually needed: honesty, resilience, and the courage to look absurd in the service of truth. So there you have it, Crates of Thebes, the philosopher who threw away his silver to polish his soul. A filthy, funny, freakishly wise figure who walked out of a mansion and into immortality, barefoot, blissful, and utterly free. Let us now turn our attention to one of the most deliciously improbable tales ever to seep out of antiquity, a tale that involves not gods nor monsters, not wars nor empires, but something far more dangerous, disreputable, and deeply upsetting to the status quo: a love affair. And not just any love affair, mind you, but one that joined a gentleman who lived like a half-plucked owl in a gutter to a lady who had been groomed for marble-floored civility and the management of household slaves. It is quite simply magnificent. Her name was Hipparchia of Maronea, and she was, by every available account, exactly the sort of young woman whom polite Athenian society liked to shape into a pleasing decorative vase, smooth, elegant, silent, and destined to spend her days managing linen inventories while nodding supportively at male opinions. But Hipparchia, gloriously, had other ideas. She had been born into considerable privilege, which in ancient Greece was a bit like being born with a pre-written script for your life. You were expected to marry someone tolerably boring, produce children of vaguely heroic proportions, and keep your thoughts, should any arise, to yourself. And then, in some dramatically unchaperoned moment, she encountered Crates. Now, what precisely she saw in him is a matter of debate. Crates was not, let us be absolutely clear, a looker. He was bald, bearded, sunburnt, and, one imagines, not unfamiliar with the intimate whiff of goat. He dressed in a single tattered cloak, lived wherever there was flaw, and carried a staff more out of necessity than drama. He was the human embodiment of the word scruffy, and that's being generous. But Crates possessed something Athens had in short supply: authenticity. He meant what he said, and said what he meant, which is always startling and often deeply inconvenient. He radiated a kind of unwashed integrity, And Hipparchia, brilliant and razor-minded, saw it, rather like someone born into a box discovering there's an entire world outside it. She did not merely admire him from afar, she pursued him, actively, relentlessly. Not even the strenuous disapproval of her family could deter her. According to tradition, her parents arranged a perfectly respectable marriage for her, which she dismissed with a flourish that must have been absolutely mortifying at the dinner table. She demanded to marry Crates. Now Crates, for all his aversion to grooming, was not without honor. He tried to put her off. In a moment that is part tragic, part Monty Python sketch, he is said to have removed his cloak in front of her, revealing presumably the full horror of his ascetic lifestyle. Every bony rib, every flea-friendly crevice, every proudly unwashed inch of him. A look what you'd be marrying gesture, if ever there was one. But Hipparchia was unfazed. She replied, according to legend, with something like, "Yes, that'll do." And so they married. Though to call it a marriage in the Athenian sense is rather like calling a boulder a chaise longue. There were no dowries, no gilded trousseau, no slaves scuttling about with wedding wreaths. Instead, the couple simply were. They lived together in the public spaces of Athens, under colonnades, in stoas, occasionally one imagines, in alcoves, helpfully out of the rain, and became the city's most dishevelled intellectual power couple. Hipparchia did not simply follow Crates into cynicism. She became a philosopher in her own right. She debated in public, she laughed at conventions, and she scorned the idea that womanhood was incompatible with wisdom. This, let us not understate, was radical. Athens tolerated a great many things, plague, Spartan invasions, sophists, but a woman philosopher, speaking in public, in the company of men, wearing the same cloak as her husband, scandalous. There's a delightful anecdote, possibly apocryphal, though that's never stopped a good story, about Hipparchia being confronted by a snide little philosopher named Theodorus. He mocked her for being a woman who abandoned the loom for logos, spinning wool for spinning arguments. She replied with a phrase that, translated loosely, reads, "I do not think I have made a bad choice in dedicating my time to education rather than the loom." Reader, she demolished him, publicly, while still dressed in what was essentially a bedsheet. And therein lies the delicious contradiction. Hipparchia, born into refinement, chose a life of grime and discourse, of onions and outrage, and flourished in it. Crates, born into comfort, found joy in simplicity. Together, they formed a kind of philosophical duet, one part satire, one part earnest rebuke to society, and all parts fascinating. They taught not by decree, but by existence. Every gesture, every insult they endured, every choice to sleep under the stars rather than a ceiling, was a statement that the world had got its priorities entirely upside down. We do not know how long they lived, or whether they had children, though some say yes, and that they too became cynics, which would have made for the worst-smelling family picnic in Athenian history. What we do know is that their very presence enraged the tidy-minded and delighted the thoughtful. So here she stands, in the annals of history, Hipparchia, the woman who saw a bearded vagabond and said, "Yes, this is the life I choose." And in doing so, she carved out a space not only for herself, but for every thinker, every misfit, every bold spirit who believes that truth matters more than trousers. And let's be honest, that's quite romantic. Athens, at its sun-bleached height, was not a city that lacked for opinions. One could scarcely walk 3 paces without tripping over a man in sandals, confidently misusing the word virtue. It was a city of thinkers, debaters, professional ponderers, all desperate to carve out their little corner of truth. But amidst the marble temples and dusty agoras, one could occasionally spot a figure that stood apart, not because he was elevated, but because he was lower. There he would be, slouched beneath a portico, squinting at the sun like it had personally offended him, gnawing perhaps on a raw onion, and engaging in what appeared to be a spirited conversation with a passing donkey. This was no vagrant in the modern sense, no mere eccentric. This was Crates, and he was making a point. Crates belonged to the most disreputable of all the philosophical tribes, the cynics. The name drawn from the Greek kynikos means dog-like, and this was no coincidence. Cynics admired the dog for its shamelessness, its indifference to wealth, its blunt honesty. A dog, after all, does not flatter kings, fuss over inheritance, or pretend to enjoy dinner parties. It sniffs, it scratches, it barks. A dog, as far as Crates was concerned, is the only truly honest citizen. But the doggishness of Crates was not just metaphorical. He was known for living with a kind of joyous disregard for the conventions of polite society. He disdained riches, rejected possessions, and displayed a sort of proud homelessness, a deliberate, philosophical vagrancy. It was not that he could not have lived in comfort, but that he would not. Comfort to him was a lie wrapped in a cushion. There are tales, some possibly embroidered by admirers or detractors, of Crates relieving himself in public, belching at orators, and offering unsolicited philosophical advice to men purchasing perfume. Whether these acts occurred exactly as described is irrelevant. The point is that he was known for it. His reputation was a living manifesto, and yet for all his disregard for bathing and general air of pungent wisdom, he was adored. Crates had that rarest of traits among philosophical types, warmth. He was not cruel, nor pompous, nor given to rhetorical bludgeoning. He was, rather wonderfully, funny. A typical Crates lesson might begin with an insult and end with a revelation. He would sidle up to an overdressed merchant, point at his silk robe, and ask how much it cost. Upon hearing the answer, he might say something along the lines of, "You paid that much to look like a tablecloth?" And then, just as the merchant was preparing to storm off in a huff, Crates would add, "You do realize no one respects you more because of your robe, don't you? They're just hoping you'll spill wine on it." His barbs were rarely malicious. They were clarifying. To be insulted by Crates was often to be handed a little mirror and told to take a long, hard look. The streets of Athens provided the perfect theatre for his performative philosophy. While others held lectures in shaded academies, Crates took to the steps, the markets, the grimy underbelly of urban life. Every interaction was a kind of lesson, every encounter an opportunity to strip away pretense. He could deflate a pompous senator with a single comment or make a slave laugh so hard he forgot he was chained. There is something wonderfully democratic about that. In a world obsessed with hierarchy, lineage, and the fretful choreography of class, Crates simply ignored the entire system. He saw no real difference between the beggar and the statesman, except perhaps that the beggar was more likely to be honest. He also held a certain disdain for books, not the knowledge they might contain, but the worship of them. Philosophy, as he practiced it, was not to be found in parchment and ink, but in onions, weather, and the odd slap of reality. To Crates, reading about virtue without living it was like reading a menu and expecting to be full. And yet, for all his scruffiness, he was no fool. Crates understood precisely how Athenian society worked. He simply refused to play by its rules. He knew the value of currency, he just chose to laugh at it. He knew the weight of social expectation, but bore it like one might wear a paper crown at a drunken banquet, with exaggerated mockery and a wink. He was, in many ways, a performance artist centuries before the term existed. But unlike the modern variety, who often seem to be trying to make the phrase, "What am I watching?" into an academic discipline, Crates actually had a point. He lived the message. He didn't just talk about detachment, he owned nothing. He didn't just criticize consumerism. He ate weeds and claimed to prefer them. To behold Crates was to see a walking contradiction made whole. A man who looked like a lunatic and spoke like a sage. A figure so committed to freedom that he had stripped his life down to its philosophical underpants and strolled into history with nothing but a cloak and a grin. And perhaps most maddeningly of all, he seemed genuinely happy. Not the strained happiness of wealth or the anxious grin of someone climbing the social ladder, but the deep, absurd, invincible joy of someone who knows exactly who they are and cares not a whit whether anyone else approves. He barked at the world, not to frighten it, but to wake it up. There exists, in every era, a certain kind of person who believes that wisdom must arrive in marbled halls, wearing a laurel wreath and speaking exclusively in 12-syllable riddles. These are the sorts who confuse solemnity with depth and complexity with insight. To them, knowledge is a thing acquired, like land or crockery sets. But for Crates, wisdom was not something to be stored or displayed. It was something to be cleared away. His philosophy was, in essence, a kind of elegant demolition. Rather than filling his head with scrolls and syllogisms, Crates preferred to unlearn. He believed that most of what people knew, or thought they knew, was little more than a collection of bad habits dressed up in togas. Social norms, ambition, piety, propriety, all of it, to Crates, was a kind of polite madness. He would have made a spectacular dinner guest, assuming one could overlook the absence of shoes and the presence of body odor so vivid it may have qualified as a separate philosophical stance. The essence of his practice was autarkia, or self-sufficiency, not the rugged individualism of mountaineers or hedge fund libertarians, but a serene, uncluttered independence, a refusal to be enslaved, not by tyrants, but by taste. He once remarked, with uncharacteristic sweetness, that he felt freer than kings because he desired nothing a king could give. A soft bed, a shiny cup, a murmured compliment from someone wearing earrings, all nice things perhaps, but deeply suspicious, because to desire them is to open the door to dependence. And dependence, Crates would argue, is the true poverty. He did not merely say these things, he lived them with disarming thoroughness. He slept on the ground, or when feeling luxurious, in the nooks of stoas, the long columned walkways of the Athenian public squares. Rain was not an inconvenience, it was a bath. Hunger was not an affliction, it was a reminder of the body's honesty. The cynics had a term for this, ascesis, training. Life, to Crates, was not about getting things, but about getting used to not having them, a kind of spiritual immunization. And yet, despite all this hair-shirt seriousness, Crates was never dour. He was not one of those bristle-lipped ascetics who treat virtue like a grudge. No, he laughed often, at himself, at others, at the absurdity of the entire human project. When mocked for wearing the same cloak in summer and winter, he supposedly replied, "Yes, and I wear the same skin all year too." Touché, sir. Athens, ever the theatre of high thought and low gossip, was divided on what to make of him. The youth adored him. The wealthy were baffled by him. The scholars sometimes tried to debate him, only to find that engaging Crates in a formal argument was like trying to play chess with a man who insists the board is on fire. Once, a young man asked Crates how he might become wise. Crates told him to go home, shave half his head, wear a torn tunic, and walk through the marketplace for 3 days in silence. The man refused. "Ah," said Crates, "then you see the problem?" To Crates, the real curriculum was not books, but shame, specifically the overcoming of it. If one could learn to endure ridicule, disgust, mockery, if one could dance naked before the statues of the gods without flinching, then one was on the path to truth. Until then, one was merely clever. There is something oddly modern about all this. Crates would have made a formidable critic of Instagram. "You care for approval," he might have said. "Why not ask a tree whether it likes your sandals?" He understood, long before the invention of advertising, that humans are exquisitely manipulable, especially when chasing dignity. He saw that pride, like perfume, smells better the less of it one wears. He could be brutal, but his brutality was surgical and always directed at delusion. There is a story, possibly myth, possibly true, but certainly revealing, of Crates encountering a young man weeping over the loss of an inheritance. Crates sat beside him, quietly, then began laughing, loudly, wheezily, like a drunk trying to start a bicycle. The young man, shocked, asked why. Crates replied, "I'm only laughing at a man who cries for a father he didn't know and gold he didn't earn." It was cruel, yes, but the young man reportedly stopped crying. A cure of sorts. It would be a mistake to think of Crates as merely a contrarian. He was not trying to shock people for fun, though fun was often a byproduct. He was trying to teach them how to be free, not legally or politically, but existentially. Free from craving, free from embarrassment, free from the need to be thought important by people whose opinions were based largely on sandals and syntax. He lived in what others would call squalor, but he saw it as clarity. He had no books, yet spoke with the wisdom of 10 libraries. He owned nothing, yet had a life so rich in insight that it continues to provoke, perplex, and inspire 2.5 millennia later. To watch Crates wander the streets of Athens, cloak flapping, staff tapping, onions bulging in his satchel, was to witness a kind of walking paradox. A man who had given everything away and somehow ended up with more. There are those whose lives end with statues and solemn speeches, odes carved in marble, and lyres played at tasteful funerals. Crates of Thebes was not among them. When he died, where and how exactly, no one quite agrees, he left behind no estate, no heirs of property, no final will scrawled on papyrus. What he left was far less tangible and infinitely more irritating to the polite world. An idea, a living, sniggering, flea-bitten idea that had walked barefoot through the streets of Athens and dared to ask, "Are you sure this is the best way to live?" He died as he had lived, lightly, absurdly, and entirely free. One must imagine the bewilderment of those who tried to make sense of his legacy. There was nothing to sell, no school to inherit, no robes, no relics, no reverent list of teachings recited in hushed tones. All he'd ever offered was a life so bafflingly pure in its contempt for pretense that even the most skeptical had to pause and wonder whether he'd been right all along. He had no need for monuments. He had disciples, though he would almost certainly have mocked them for calling themselves that. He taught not by command, but by contagion. His life was an infectious challenge. There were young men, many young men, who saw him, this sun-darkened wanderer, with twinkling eyes and uncombed thoughts, and found themselves gripped by the strange conviction that the best way to understand the world might just be to give up trying to impress it. Among them were thinkers who would carry forward the cynic flame, stoking it into flickering philosophical fires across the Hellenic world. Most famously, there was one Diogenes, a man whose antics made Crates look positively suburban by comparison. But make no mistake, it was Crates who handed him the lantern and said, "Go on then, let's see what you find." The legacy of Crates, if it can be called that, is not tidy. There is no school of Cratinism, no formal doctrine one can swat up before an exam. His thought was not a system, it was a provocation, an invitation to discard illusion, to try living without masks, to taste freedom not as an abstract political slogan, but as something that begins the moment one stops pretending to be what the world wants. He would, of course, have scoffed at any attempt to canonize him. The very notion of being remembered would likely have earned one of his lopsided grins and a muttered remark about the ego's talent for reincarnation. "You want to be remembered?" he might say. "Be useful in life. After that, who cares?" And yet he is remembered, not as a saint, or even as a particularly clean man, but as a kind of philosophical trickster, a Socrates with even fewer trousers, a gadfly with less patience and more onions. He asked awkward questions with his whole body. Why do we spend our lives earning coins we don't need, to buy things we don't want to impress people we don't like? Why is a man who walks barefoot thought mad, but a man who owns 50 pairs of sandals is thought admirable? Why do we cling to manners when honesty would serve better, and why do we mistake seriousness for wisdom? These are not questions that fade. They persist, like a stone in the sandal, like a burp at a banquet. And perhaps that is Crates' true gift. Not that he offered answers, but that he made answers squirm. That he took the shining platitudes of Athenian virtue and rubbed them gleefully in the dust. That he taught, in his tattered cloak and stubborn grin, that one might live a good life without luxury, without position, and perhaps even without soap. A life lived plainly, sharply, laughingly. That, in the end, was the final lesson. That dignity is a poor substitute for truth, and that the truly wise wear their philosophy not like a medal, but like a second skin, unwashed, ill-fitting, and absolutely impossible to ignore. Crates of Thebes walked through the world without fear, without possessions, and most wonderfully, without shame. And in doing so, he left behind something greater than a monument. He left behind a challenge.